So I'm now going to introduce Clemens Winkler. It's very difficult to find a good summary just to describe just the scope and breadth and depth of what you do, not only in biodesign, but across all kinds of areas of emerging technology at multiple different scales. And I guess we're going to see a very short glimpse of that work today. And I also looked at where we could associate you, what your best affiliation was. And I realized that if I went through all of the places where you've taught or been educated or been an educator, I would likely die of jealousy before I got to the end of the list. So I'll give the floor to you, and I'm sure you can give a better introduction to yourself. So, okay, well, if you're ready to share your screen and to turn off your on your mic.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see that? Yeah, does it work? Hey, yeah. Yeah, welcome everybody to my presentation, especially focusing on the participatory approaches to biodesign and research practice, as well as in teaching. And many thanks to Dan Wiener and Alex and the whole HBBE team for inviting me to this event. Yeah, as Matthew briefly introduced me, it's, yeah, not so easy to keep track on my educational background, possibly. My disciplinary background is in industrial design and interaction design originally, but I studied as well in experimental physics, being involved in programming and electronics and, yeah, material discoveries, and I've taught in different institutions. And right now I'm here located in Berlin at the research cluster Matters of Activity at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where I will talk later on about it as well. So I would like to focus my talk, as I said, on participatory events, not so much on students' projects, but rather also from my approach on biodesign. And I think a challenge is for biodesign as a discipline to really question like large contexts contributing to the Anthropocene and translating hidden material languages into tangible interfaces, into to be experienced, to be embodied and discussed furthermore. And in the background, you see an image of an installation, an exhibition I've just recently done this summer. I will also talk about that, like on the title of Nutrition Clouds, that also in here biodesign as a technique in my practice. So I would like to start in creating the environment, as you heard earlier also from the other speakers, how important it is to have actually an environment, call it lab, call it a studio, a hub, where you can just collect different materials and instruments, technical apparatuses, research methods, teaching methods. And I've used this space yeah, as a rather pop-up toolkit, yeah, to be on the road teaching in various institutions, and focusing on material guided and material induced processes and methods. So here I would split in two areas, like of dealing and designing with materials. On the one hand, I designed workshop formats which were primarily material induced mediation approaches, for example, tracing carbon, tracing sugar, tracing water, glycerine, and examine possible interfaces to the materials. And on the other hand, working and designing with materials came from a semantic and a narrative-driven approach, and then expressing them through material methods. So they're these kind of both like top-down and bottom-up approaches that I'm just juggling around also in my practices and mediation processes. The term narrative here and narrative materials, you could see narrative rather as a skin stretching around the material that allows permeabilities, like exchange processes from the material in terms of values. So we could also, the other way around, ask how valuable is a certain material. So that depends on, yeah, often the narrative we are telling as designers. So for example, when we look now on our screens on the liquid crystals are trapped here in between the electrodes, get heated, and show up as colors in red, green, and blue. But like besides this really specific application, there is of course a myth behind the liquid crystals we could develop, we could explore, for example, in the 70s media art, where, for example, Jean-Paul Lève just dropped liquid crystals on an overhead projector, and then through the temperature changes, there's this constantly flow of colors and states in matter that are like rather like addressing to myths. And when we go even back into the 19th century in the exploration and discovery of the liquid crystals, we go into botany, where the liquid crystals were found in the roots of a plant as a natural resource, not really figuring out at that time, is it actually solid or is it liquid? What is it? So it was not valid at this time, but actually there is like a tracing back from the material, from the really specific use and the myths behind it towards the ecological entanglement of it. So here this tension is something really, I would say, in design we have to deal with, where we find applications on the one hand, but on the other hand, we leave also the myths and the potentials for creativity to work with the material. And therefore, it's also often important to be site-specific, to also go out of the lab, as we heard it also earlier, how important it is also to explore landscapes, to be site-specific in impermanent landscapes, like you see here in the background. It's from a seminar with students where we went to the volcanic island Stromboli, to a volcano, to explore the sulfuric fumes and to work in this vapor and to explore like new ways of practicing design. And as Andrew Pickering, the social anthropologist, describes it as a performative dance of agencies. He's describing it as in a situated observationist, trying this, seeing what happens, trying something else, instead of bending nature to our will. Like we have to be patient, we have to observe, like we just heard in the other talks, we have to let go and to have to co-design. And for this, I would say methodology-wise, we have to dive into the material. So when we sit into, say, a cloud of flour, we can ask, okay, how is this material actually speaking to me? And then we have different methods. We can qualitatively say, I can listen to it, actually. I hear something. I hear this whistling noise. I can smell something. Maybe I taste it. I can also qualitatively say, actually, I'm in this material and can explore it on the base of the levels of sugar. Can I do something with this knowledge, or can I even expand it to a broader context and scale? And I think when these methods meet on site, like on the volcano, the students were plus the performativity of the whole event, were able to observe the material processes being in the material instead of designing something in the hands of the material designer as the author. I came up with a workshop series called Performing Clouds, where I wanted to also discuss these kind of agencies that are all involved in complex processes such as cloud formation processes and climate processes. And now to translate that to biodesign, from my approach, it was really interesting in this Performing Cloud series to focus on the biology of the clouds, we heard it in the first talk, on tackling big issues like climate change and treating, for example, the atmosphere as a biosphere. So when we look at the biosphere, there is this transposing of right now of materials. We have lots of carbon in the atmosphere. We could say, it's bad, but actually the carbon is really necessary on the ground to form any kind of life. So there's lots of transposing happening right now. And the question is here, how can we really go into these biological cycles? How do we find examples in nature? Like here, this kind of lesion that is fed by sulfur oxide that comes mainly right now from agricultural sites and cities. So we have this in the forests quite a lot worldwide. And also when we zoom into the clouds, we find, of course, then all the materiality that sits in the vapor and in the let's say invisibility of matter and of the air we breathe. And also around us, there's lots of, we call it microbial clouds in air biology, where you say, okay, there is actually lots of substance to work with and to design with, but we have to be patient and we really have to see how this adapts to our way of performing. And here I've set up different microfluidic devices that were able to, for participants to work with these kind of microfluidic devices in inhaling different substances into the air. This also becomes a bit sarcastic nowadays, especially in this year, where we really have to question how do we deal with our needs of our surrounding, how do we deal with designing air, such an immersive but also intrusive medium. So I've set up an exhibition here in summer at the State Studio. It's an art science gallery in Berlin, and I was really lucky to exhibit at the end the nutrition clouds. So you see lots of vaporizers in space addressing the materiality of air and questioning the metabolizing effects of the invisible in between, and also questioning the narratives of there is something in the air, we could say, but how do we actually question it, especially these days? So there were a couple of vaporizers addressing questions on the ground. We have this also in the industry right now with aerofarming or aqua farming, where plants get fed by nutrition clouds instead of putting the plants into the soil. Or we have it on a human level where we think now about vaccines. I mean, how would we create a narrative? It's now, instead of protecting ourselves with masks, we have to do it right now. But if a vaccine would be available, could we also spread it? How the coronavirus is spread? Or how do we deal with that? These are questions that were arising on a sudden on the human level. A physician came to the gallery in advance to make sure this kind of air design was fitting the regulations of the corona pandemic. And she said that the droplets actually they wash out the air. So there were no harmful substances, airborne substances like around these vaporizers, luckily. But also in terms of scaling up to an atmosphere, when these vaporizers were scaling up, in the gallery space, discussing, like people were discussing, or we were discussing in a participatory event, the questions of global impact of inhaling like nutrients into the air. For example, different bacteria in binding the carbon, the nitrogen, and also we heard it earlier, bacteria that lower the temperature of water, the pseudomonas, they even travel transcontinental through an ice crystal, ice nuclei in clouds, which is really tremendous to think of, these really tiny particles acting globally, and how do we adapt as humans to that? So that was a learning from my side for biodesign, like just a quick insight on biodesign in my practice, to see the organic ways in designing with, instead of this classic form-giving understanding of dealing with design. And right now, to end up with, I'm affiliated, like I mentioned in the beginning, in the Cluster of Excellence here in the Alexander von Humboldt University, where we are a hub of natural scientists, like microbiologists, material scientists, neuroscientists, but also ethnographers, anthropologists, and architects and designers. And we are all now teaming up on a research unit for the next 5 years, embedding also teaching perspectives for practice-based PhDs just sharing knowledge and combining the question of how do we deal, actually, we call it the new analog in digital times, how do we get back into the meta with all the knowledge we're gaining through the digital. And you're welcome to, because we just launched today our virtual platform, virtualspace.meta-activity.de. Thanks a lot.